have water, I'm good, thank you. Oh, sure, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. I'm Brennon Mendez, and I'm the fellow with the Emmett Institute, and I'll be moderating this lovely panel. I hope you all had a great lunch. So this is about place-based approaches to transforming fleets. Cities and air districts across California and the US have begun to employ place-based tools to reduce emissions from transportation sources. These include tools like indirect source rules, or ISRs, under the Clean Air Act, which require locations that attract and generate significant transportation pollution, like warehouses, ports, rail yards, to take steps to reduce that pollution. Jurisdictions have also begun to consider and enact zero-emission vehicle-only zones, delivery zones for certain vehicles. And this panel will explore those place-based regulations of vehicles and ask whether the use of those tools can and should be expanded. So we're going to have some presentations from our lovely panelists, but I'll just give short introductions to our three panelists that we have here today. So we have Jessi Fierro, Senior Attorney at CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and a board member of the California Lawyers Association, and formerly a director with the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution District. We have Adriano Martinez, Deputy Managing Attorney of Earthjustice, where he chairs the Transportation Practice Group, and he's a member of the San Pedro Bay Ports Sustainable Supply Chain Advisory Committee, and formerly the California Public Utilities Commission and California Energy Commission Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Committee. And lastly, we have Amy Turner, Director of the city's Climate Law Initiative at the Sabin Center and an Associate Research Scholar at Columbia Law School, and formerly a co-founder of the NYC Climate Action Alliance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jessi for our first presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. Like, they just turned on these really bright lights, and I hope none of you were taking, I really wanted to look cool today, and then right as people were taking pictures, I'm like, oh my gosh, that can't be necessary. It's already hot in here. What are we doing? But anyway, I'll try to look cool for the rest of the presentation. I shouldn't say that. It's a long presentation, and it's right after lunch, so I just want to make sure everyone's really, really ready for this very exciting indirect source review presentation. But it is exciting. This is interesting stuff. We've already heard this morning. We know, that's why we're here. We know the challenges is real. We know it's important. We know that a lot of the tools that we thought we had maybe aren't as available as they used to be. So we got to get creative, and we got to think about new ways to get these really important emissions reductions. And even though I'm currently an attorney with CARB, as was already mentioned, I worked at the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District for 18 years. And amongst that time, I started in 2005, 11 months before the indirect source review rule at San Joaquin Valley was adopted. So I had a front row seat and was on the sidelines and maybe the front lines a little bit as that really innovative rule was adopted. And I don't know how many of you know the San Joaquin Valley. It's not thought of as a progressive place. And so for that, right? See, I got to laugh right after lunch. We're off to a good start, gang. You're welcome. It was a really interesting time to see really important, innovative things happen, and none of it was obvious at the time. I think we can look back at that rule and at the South Coast rule and really all the rules that the air districts and CARB have adopted over the years, and we've learned a lot along the way, right? Hindsight's 20/20, and we can look back and think, oh, that worked well, or maybe that didn't work well, and we kind of lose sight of the fact of how hard it was when it was happening, and it's just worth recognizing that because we're in one of those kind of nodes again, right, where things are nebulous and it's hard to know how to rebuild. So we can look to the past, both to see the successes we did have to give us the courage to keep trying to find new and innovative ways to do things. I do want to start by recognizing, just for the sake of everyone here, because I know we came here today with a lot of different backgrounds and levels of experience when it comes to air law in this country. And so very, very high level, very quick, we have federal EPA that sets ambient air quality standards about what would be healthy for people to breathe. And the federal government also regulates certain types of interstate transportation or could. They don't always do it, but they have the authority to regulate interstate pollution. So the federal government would be looking at trains, ships, and airplanes. States then have a lot of authority under the Clean Air Act to develop the roadmaps for attaining those standards. And generally that means you're doing air quality modeling, you're looking at your emissions, you're doing a lot of technical analysis, and then identifying regulations that are going to help you attain those standards. Now, this is called cooperative federalism. It's not always as cooperative as we would like it to be. But then to further complicate things in California, some have called this cooperative sub-federalism, where California is further divided into various regions that are regulating air quality within their air basin. And so then who has the authority to regulate what is divided even further. California does have that special permission to get a Clean Air Act waiver to regulate certain types of mobile sources. Not always very smoothly, as we're seeing, but we've done that successfully in the past. But then local air districts, like the San Joaquin Valley Air District, where I used to work, in the South Coast AQMD, and 35 air districts altogether throughout the state of California, are principally charged with regulating the stuff that doesn't move, right? The wood stoves and the factories and the refineries and all those things. So the local control, local decision makers who are supposed to have expertise in their regions, working with their local communities, the business community, as well as the health advocates and everyone else, to figure out what is needed in their region to meet the air quality standards. And so this is a slide that came from a recent CARB presentation. I do think it's worth acknowledging, at least briefly, how much California air quality has improved, thanks to that partnership between federal, state, and local agencies. Air quality in California now is much, much better than it was 30, 40 years ago. We're not done yet. There's still a lot to do. And our goals are really, in California, they're coming from a few different places. One is the State Implementation Plan, or SIP, and that's the roadmap I referenced earlier, where the federal government says, clean up your air, and the state says, okay, this is how I'm going to do that. That's the SIPs. So the SIPs are all about meeting the ozone standard and the particulate matter standard and a few other criteria pollutants. We also have a scoping plan in California that charts how we're going to improve pollution when it comes to reduce pollutants for climate change pollutants. And then we also have AB 617, which is looking at the most impacted communities of California and recognizing that even when we're meeting our SIP goals and our climate goals, there are places that are overly burdened. So let's make sure we're taking a close look at that areas and doing what we can. So as you can see in this timeline, there are a lot of goals. We have a lot of things that are driving us forward for the next 20 years and beyond as we figure out what are we going to do next. And we've already done a lot, but there's still more to do. And when it comes to mobile source emissions inventories, so that's the cataloging of all this stuff that's going up into the air, we know that mobile sources are a huge part of the ongoing problem. And so I mentioned that air districts will control the stationary and area-wide slices of these pies. And NOx is of particular importance to ozone and particulate matter. Direct PM emissions are also important. Then you have your climate change pollutants. But you see that it's the stationary sources are a relatively small piece of what's left. And that's not to say you shouldn't keep looking there. You should look at every source of pollution and the developing technologies. And anything that might be feasible, you got to implement to meet these health goals and to meet our climate change goals and to protect our AB 617 areas. But it's really the mobile sources are a tremendous driver. We cannot meet any of our goals without looking at mobile sources. And as you heard from in the earlier panels, California does have some authority to adopt mobile source regulations through the waiver process. We've had over 100 waivers and authorizations approved over the past several decades, but recently we had to rescind some of our waiver requests rather than have them disapproved by EPA. So what do we do about mobile sources instead? If we can't directly regulate those tailpipes, what are we going to do? One of the earlier presenters talked about in-use regulations, and in-use regulation is dealing with the use of a mobile source, and there are some opportunities there, although you have to be careful because there have been examples, at least one example, of an in-use regulation that was really just a tailpipe regulation in disguise and ended up being struck down. But another really important opportunity is indirect source review. And this is like a hybrid between a stationary source regulation and a mobile source regulation. Because what you do is you look at the mobile sources, but you assign them to a facility. And you say, okay, warehouse, you are the reason why there's mobile source emissions here. It's because of these trucks wouldn't be driving around this neighborhood for no reason. They're driving around because of this warehouse. So let's give the warehouse some responsibility for addressing those emissions. The warehouse is the magnet. It's the indirect source. And that's the South Coast case. In the San Joaquin case, it's not just warehouses. So we would say, all right, residential development. You want to build a new development over here with 200 houses. Well, now there's going to be passenger cars. Those cars would not be driving there without that development. So you're assigning the mobile source emissions to that place. So it still feels like a stationary source, right? Even though you're usually more worried about the mobile source emissions. And so that's what an indirect source regulation is. It's really meant to reduce mobile source emissions, but you're doing it by targeting the place, the geography, the things that you're building there through an indirect source review or ISR, or sometimes they're called indirect source rules. But that's basically what we're talking about here. Where do we even get the authority to do this? Well, it starts in the Clean Air Act. There is a specific section in the Clean Air Act, 110A5, it's right there on the slide for you, that specifically gives states the authority, if they would like, to have an ISR program in their SIP. It does not require them to. And so this has been in the Clean Air Act for some time, and no one used it until San Joaquin Valley in 2005. So I already explained what an indirect source review program is, but that the legal description is there for your reference as well. We also have authority in the California Health and Safety Code, and that section of code, it specifically grants air districts the authority to use an ISR for the purposes of meeting state standards. And I didn't even talk about that yet. I already mentioned that EPA has federal standards. California also has standards that are sometimes the same, but often even more stringent than the federal standards. So in the Health and Safety Code, an air district could have an ISR program to meet the state standards. So it's all about protecting public health either way. So San Joaquin Valley, as I said, not a progressive area, but they had the very first ISR program in 2005, and it was a really interesting time. There's so much to say about how that went. You know, I'm really proud that that agency managed to have that role, and we never took it for granted. It was really hard to know the right way to structure that role. And that particular role, the way San Joaquin Valley did it, and it's not perfect, but it was an interesting start for this type of program. Rather than focus on a type of facility, what they did is they just focused on new developments. And there's all these thresholds, whether you're building an industrial complex or residential development or warehouses, but something new. If you're going to build a new thing in the region, you have to quantify the indirect mobile sources that are resulting because of that new thing you're building. And they looked at both the construction emissions as well as the operational emissions. So building the thing, that creates some emissions, and then once it's operational, like people living there or the factory producing whatever it is it's doing, then you had to quantify the emissions from that. Well, no one had ever done it quite that way before. There were existing models through the CEQA process that did something sort of like that. So they were able to take some lessons from that and focus specifically on how VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, was increasing as a result of that project. So the way that the rule ends up working now is that anytime a developer over a certain threshold is building something, they have to do something called an air impact assessment. They have to use specific tools that are approved by the air district, and they have to quantify the additional mobile source emissions that are expected to result from that project, and then they have to mitigate those emissions. And they do it through through two main ways. One is that they can introduce designs into their project to reduce emissions, so like voluntarily using the cleanest construction equipment, building in more transit stops, more bike lanes, things like that. None of those things alone would get you out of paying the fees, but each little thing can help a developer bring those fees down, and then whatever's left, they pay fees into a program. And on the one hand, that might sound frustrating because there are people who will say, well, they didn't really reduce emissions, they're just generating sprawl, and those emissions are still happening, and there's an argument to be made there. But I will say that they take those fees and then they get funneled into the existing grant programs, incentive programs. And those are all operated in accordance to state policies like the Moyer program. And every year they report on all the projects that were funded with ISR fees. So they're real reductions. They can be proven after the fact. And so we've seen a lot of developers actually do some pretty interesting things to reduce emissions directly within their project as well as indirectly after the fact through the mitigation fees. Naturally, not only was it hard to get the rule adopted, but it was also difficult to defend it, and we did face legal challenges in San Joaquin Valley in both state court and in federal court. And it was a long battle, and happily, the Air District prevailed on all of the challenges against that particular rule. The citations are there. I'm going to go on and gloss over these parts to get to some of the rest of the presentation. But I think this quote from the federal court case is pretty important in my second sub-bullet. Rule 9510, that's their ISR rule number. It does not target vehicles or engines. It targets emissions and requires emissions reductions from a development site as a whole. It does not require a vehicle or engine not to emit more than a certain amount of a given pollutant. It requires a development site not to do so. The site, because it is targeted at a development site as a whole, its standard or requirement relates to the emissions from an indirect source and not from non-road vehicles or engines. So I think that quote's really, really important, and it gets to what I said at the beginning, is that you're trying to reduce mobile sources, but you're doing it by assigning it to a site and giving that site the responsibility and also a little bit of flexibility to come up with ways that work for that specific application to reduce mobile source emissions that otherwise the Air District couldn't touch at all. The Air District, waiver or no waiver, the Air District can't reduce mobile source emissions except through these indirect ways, ISR being the key one. There are a couple of other smaller examples. Both San Joaquin and South Coast have like employer-based trip reduction type rules, but those are pretty small compared to what can be achieved through ISR. So this shows, this came from San Joaquin's most recent annual report. So if you're interested in the San Joaquin Valley ISR program, every single year they have to publish a report that tells the board and everyone in the public how many air impact assessment applications were received. And you can see how much it grew over time, up and down a little bit. San Joaquin Valley is actually a very fast-growing region. I think a lot of people, it's more rural than a lot of areas of California, but in terms of percent growth, it is a very fast-growing area, and there's a lot of reasons for that. In part because it's relatively affordable, in part because maybe it's a little easier to develop things there than other places, but at least ISR is getting some benefit along the way. And then in terms of actual emissions reductions, this is the emissions reductions from approved ISR projects just during a one-year period. And so this is in total tons, not tons per day. And so ISR alone is not going to get San Joaquin Valley into attainment of all the standards. And if you know San Joaquin Valley, you know they definitely have challenges in attaining those standards. But it's important to do something, right? I think a lot of that's part of what we're talking about today is what can you do when the things that you would have otherwise done just aren't available to you anymore. So real reductions are happening as a result of ISR in the San Joaquin Valley. The South Coast rule was adopted more recently, just in 2021, and it targets warehouses in particular. And so for South Coast, they're not just looking at new warehouses, they're looking at all existing warehouses, and they're of certain size, and they're requiring those warehouses to identify ways to reduce the mobile source, the indirect mobile source pollution that's associated with those facilities. I should briefly acknowledge that South Coast also has a locomotive ISR type program, but because of the issues with the California waiver for the in-use locomotives, that South Coast locomotive rule is also in limbo, unfortunately. But at least South Coast has their ISR rule. I will say I was still working at San Joaquin Valley when South Coast came up with their ISR rule, and it just pained me when people came to the San Joaquin governing board meetings and said, "Why don't you guys have ISR?" It's like, we have had it for 15 years. You know, it's like when you're a kid and you do some cool thing before all your friends and then they take credit for it. That's how it always felt like that at San Joaquin Valley. And again, that's not to say, I think San Joaquin Valley should, in fact, look at what South Coast is doing because the rules are different. They accomplish different things. I'll try not to take it too personally, especially since I'm in the South Coast Air Basin right now. I should see, I was going to try to play it cool. I blew it again. Anyway, South Coast, of course, also had its legal challenges with respect to its ISR rule, and I'm very happy to report that they also prevailed in those challenges, and that wasn't that long ago. But the court in that case said that the rule does not command that any businesses only purchase vehicles with particular emissions characteristics. Used to be people would try to do like these fleet rules and call them an in-use regulation, and you didn't get away with that. And so I think the people that attacked South Coast ISR were trying to do that same sort of analysis and say, oh, you're requiring this facility to have a certain kind of fleet. And the court didn't fall for that. They said, no, businesses can comply with this rule by taking other actions. They can take any action that they want. And so for this reason, the rule is not a command and control regulation. And the engine manufacturer's case, which is that fleet rule case, it is distinguishable. So again, I just want to emphasize that it's about reducing mobile source emissions by focusing on the site itself, not the site's fleet, but the site itself. So we have two existing ISR rules that are getting or about to get emissions reductions, and I think that it's important for us, seeing that maybe our preferred tools aren't available, to think about other ways to use an ISR type regulation to continue to reduce mobile source emissions where we can. And I wanted to point out a recent UC Berkeley report that was looking at aviation decarbonization. And one of the points that report made was that an air district could choose to direct ISR type requirements on airports. And that's something, and that report analyzed some potential preemption issues. So I don't think this is a slam dunk, but I think this is another example that's been documented by another party fairly recently about how if you can't regulate the tailpipe and you can't regulate the fleet, maybe you can at least regulate the site. And that way the site is encouraged to come up with ways to reduce reliance on the dirtier types of vehicles that might be used at those places. And there really is an ongoing need in the SIP. I wanted to tell a quick story, and then I'll pass the clicker on to one of my co-panelists. So in the summer of 2023, South Coast Air District got very, very frustrated because EPA wasn't acting on one of their plans. That's that cooperative federalism I talked about earlier. The state and an air district sends a plan to EPA, and then EPA is supposed to approve it. EPA didn't approve this particular plan. South Coast took matters into their own hands and say, okay, well, we're going to sue EPA for not acting on our plan. EPA thought, well, we didn't act on your plan because you assigned us a lot of emissions reductions, and you don't get to tell us what to do, so we're just not going to approve that part of the plan. And so because South Coast then sued them for not acting on the plan, EPA had to act. And the only action they would have taken, and this was under the previous administration, they disapproved South Coast's plan because South Coast told the federal government, we cannot protect public health unless you regulate the sources under your control. So EPA proposed to disapprove the plan, and South Coast was very upset about it and had this, one of my favorite press releases I've ever read. This is a scathing press release. South Coast was really not pleased about this and very frustrated, and rightly so, because there is so much to do to protect public health and reduce emissions, and EPA wasn't doing what South Coast thought was their fair share. Here's one of my favorite quotes. EPA's action today, while disappointing, is not surprising, given decades of inertia. This decision came after South Coast sued the agency for waiting 2 years past the deadline. And while the hope was that EPA would step forward and follow the roadmap South Coast provided in South Coast plan to reduce emissions from federal sources, they instead hid behind technicalities in the Clean Air Act and point the finger at California and South Coast AQMD. As U.S. EPA states in its disapproval, NOx emissions in the South Coast have decreased 70% since 1997, but NOx emissions from federal sources have only decreased by 15% over that same time period. And yet they offer no solution or approach other than to ask South Coast AQMD to do more to reduce emissions from sources they know are beyond our control. So the fight is still happening. Like, I don't want to overly demonize any of the agencies here. I think there are a lot of good people doing really hard work at all of these agencies. And I think I've even heard you say this before, Adriano, that, well, South Coast could have more ISR, and that's a way to deal with some of these federal sources. I don't think it's fair for South Coast to just act like they can completely wash their hands of this. But it shows the tension, even in a more favorable administration, of how important and how frustrating and how difficult it can be to reduce emissions from these sources. But ISR has to have a role in all of this. I will say, out of the South Coast SIP fiasco last summer, the agencies came together and they tried to identify several ways to keep reducing emissions across the South Coast Air Basin and came out with the joint statement last summer. And one of the things that came out of that statement was CARB is looking at ways to try to reduce emissions from the aviation sector, which is extremely challenging. There are delicate preemption issues, but maybe an ISR type program, if South Coast wanted to get involved and have a rule like that, that could be an option for them too. I did want to briefly mention, because I think I'm past time, AB 914. This is new. This was just introduced last month, and it's currently in the process of being amended and discussed, but this particular bill, if approved, would give CARB, the State Air Resources Board, the authority to have a more active role in regulating indirect sources. And right now, State Health and Safety Code only references the Air District's authority to do this and not CARB. So I think that this is a bill that I hope some form of it makes it so that we can continue to be really effective partners in the fight to keep reducing mobile source emissions. I did want to briefly mention before I know, I hear the Oscar music right now trying to call me off stage, but I see a lot of law students here in particular. I know I believe Miles already talked about the importance of joining the California Lawyers Association, and I'm on the board, so they require me to say this every time I talk to everyone. But it really is a wonderful organization. If you're a law student, you can join for free. You can join for free for your first 3 years of practice. It's a wonderful way to network with other attorneys and get to come to events like this. And there's a law student LinkedIn page that has content from all the sections, not just environmental law. So I hope many of you go into environmental law, but you might do even more than that. So look at the other sections. There's a lot of great opportunities for fellowships and scholarships and programs to support law students and new lawyers. So the link is right there, and feel free to look me up on LinkedIn if any of you ever have questions about the Lawyers Association. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. With that, I am officially handing the clicker over.
Let's see, I am on here. Great. Well, thanks, Jessi. And thank you to everyone at the Emmett Institute for having me. This has been a really wonderful day so far. So my name is Amy Turner. I work at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and I spend my days and many of my nights thinking about problems from the local government perspective. So in this particular instance, we're talking about freight vehicles, in particular, like e-commerce vehicles. We all get lots and lots of packages delivered from Amazon and other places, and this has led to an influx of freight traffic, not just those cute electric Rivians that deliver the package to your door, but lots of much larger, dirtier freight trucks that go in and out of these massive warehouses or distribution centers. And so from the local government perspective, when you think about how to solve an intractable problem like that, you have to think through a good number of legal constraints that local governments find themselves within. So last summer, I published a paper, Cities, E-commerce, and Public Health, which I think was included in your materials, looking at 3 potential ways for local governments to reduce, through regulation or otherwise, the greenhouse gas emissions and very harmful local air pollution that comes from those freight vehicles, particularly in and around the communities in which these warehouses or distribution centers are sited. So, e-commerce is something that has expanded really rapidly over the last several years. The pandemic is sort of one factor, but, the market was really pushing things in that direction anyway. Amazon accounts for about 40% of the market, so they make a good proxy for some of the stats that you'll find. But, Amazon sales went up by over a third between 2019 and 2020. These last mile delivery centers, or whatever you want to call them, bring in sometimes hundreds of diesel-fueled truck trips every day. And they have, these facilities have really been largely unregulated or underregulated at the local level. So, zoning codes historically have not considered warehouses to be particularly harmful uses. They didn't really anticipate this sort of traffic coming in and out of these facilities. didn't necessarily anticipate the environmental impact that would be associated with them. So many of these have either been, built as of right, or old facilities are used as of right, and have not been meaningfully regulated at the local level. That is changing to some extent, like zoning codes are changing, but that only gets at new warehouse facilities, not the ones that have already proliferated. This is obviously a particularly awful problem in disadvantaged communities. So there have been several studies along these lines. One from the Environmental Defense Fund found that Black, Hispanic/Latino, and low-income populations live near warehouses at rates that are 59%, 48%, and 42% higher than would be expected based on statewide statistics. So those populations much more likely to live near a warehouse. A study out of the University of Washington similarly found that communities of color have far more freight traffic in them, even though they receive many fewer packages than white communities. Consumer Reports, the magazine, looked at some data from the Census Bureau and found that 69% of Amazon warehouses have a greater share of people of color living within a mile radius than the general population in those particular metro areas. So we have these harms from these freight distribution centers. They are much, much, much more acute in low-income populations and communities of color. So another, sort of why are we here framing question is that local governments are highly legally constrained in lots of areas, but in particular in their ability to regulate the characteristics of vehicles, particularly as relate to vehicle emissions or fuel economy. So, a local government or even an air district can't just say, well, freight vehicles coming into our community have got to meet such and such fuel economy standard, or have got to be hybrids, or have got to be electric. They are, preempted by federal law from doing that. And so I'll talk through some of the main federal laws at play in this space. The first is the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act Section 209 has a preemption provision. No state or political subdivision thereof. Political subdivisions means local governments, also air districts and other sort of sub-state governmental agencies or instrumentalities. So no state or political subdivision thereof shall adopt or attempt to enforce any standard relating to the control of emissions from new motor vehicles. So local governments are not able to set vehicle pollution standards for the most part for vehicles operating in or sold in their communities. There are some exceptions to that. Jessi talked about in-use restrictions. So, this covers things like anti-idling laws or yearly emissions tests. But for the most part, you're not able to pass a law that would require folks to drive very low emissions freight trucks. There's a similar preemption provision in a law called the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, or EPCA. No state or political subdivision can adopt or enforce a law or regulation relating to fuel economy standards for automobiles. So this is, obviously regulates a different thing, air pollution versus fuel economy, but the preemption provisions work very similarly. The end result is the same. A local government is not going to be able to require, for example, that freight vehicles that drive into warehouses in their communities are hybrid or electric. There is case law that expressly extends EPCA preemption to hybrid vehicles, sort of as a proxy for fuel economy. The case law does not address electric vehicles. I just don't think we've gotten there yet, but there's good reason to think that it would extend in that direction as well. There's another significant federal law at play here, which is the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, or the F4A, which prohibits state and local governments from enacting laws and regulations related to the price, route, or service of motor carriers with respect to the transportation of property. This is just a hugely important federal law in the spaces that we're going to talk about. In the interest of time, I'm not going to mention it again, but if you'd like to know more about it, it is covered in the paper. So back to the Clean Air Act and EPCA. The way what this really ends up meaning is that while local governments and states, for that matter, cannot set vehicle standards relating to vehicle tailpipe pollution or fuel economy, they are allowed to set incentives. They're allowed to incentivize the sort of vehicle use that they would like to see. And there's a good deal of case law on what counts as an incentive and what counts as a de facto mandate. But the case law doesn't extend to the kinds of tactics that I'm going to discuss today, which include ISRs as well as low emissions delivery zones. But we can sort of glean from the case law like ideas of what might or might not be allowable for a local government to do. So the first case here was in King County, Washington. In that case, a court upheld a program that set aside 50 taxi licenses for hybrid taxis. So kind of hard to get a taxi license, I suppose, in King County. You can kind of cut to the front of the line and get a taxi license easily if you have a hybrid vehicle. That was upheld, not preempted, under an EPCA preemption analysis. It was viewed as an incentive. The next case, Association of Taxi Cab Operators USA, this is the Fifth Circuit case. This upheld a law that allowed compressed natural gas taxis to cut to the head of the airport pickup line. So, you want to use a taxi, probably you want those hefty fares that come from driving people away from the airport. If you're driving a CNG taxi, this is clearly an old case, you can cut to the front of the airport line. So again, this was upheld as an incentive. This was under a Clean Air Act preemption analysis. There was no preemption found. And there's a quote from the case that I like. The city of Dallas, in the view of the court, altered the shopping decisions for traditional cab drivers in deciding where in the city to operate, but they did not effectively compel a particular course of action. So if you had a non-CNG taxi, you might just decide to pick up rides places other than the airport. The last case that I'll highlight here is called Metro Taxi Cab Board of Trade versus New York City. And this case struck down a program in New York City that set a pricing differential in which the owners of hybrid taxi cabs made more money from their drivers than the owners of internal combustion engine taxi cabs. And there's a bunch of stuff in the pleadings around what those pricing differentials were. It was pretty significant. But basically what happened here is the city, New York City, tried to set this up as an incentive for taxi cab owners to buy hybrid taxis. And the court said, no, this really amounts to a de facto mandate. And so they held that requirement, or that incentive, I should say, in quotes, preempted under an EPCA preemption analysis. So this sort of shows, the very sort of like tight parameters within which local governments have to think about whether or not they can regulate or incentivize vehicle pollution or fuel economy. So that brings me to the two kinds of strategies that I'm going to talk through, and all of that federal law is sort of relevant as we talk about them. The first is the warehouse indirect source rule, and this is a version of ISR that Jessi talked about, specific to warehouses or, in the case of many cities, very specifically, these large distribution centers, could be Amazon, but other companies as well. So these are rules that regulate the warehouse or the distribution facility, that stationary source, in its capacity as an indirect source of freight vehicle emissions. Jessi already talked about the South Coast program, the WARE for short, but I'll just highlight how it works. So what happens here, warehouses larger than 100,000 square feet, operators are required to earn a certain number of what they call WARE points. And Jessi posted the formula as to how a warehouse is given its requirement of points. And then there's a list of options from which the warehouse operator can choose to earn those points. It can acquire or use zero-emission vehicle trucks or near-zero-emission vehicle trucks. It can reduce truck trips. It can install on-site solar, use on-site solar. It can even install off-site air filtration in places like schools and daycare centers and other sensitive receptors. And if none of that works for them, they can actually just purchase a wear point for $1,000. Or if that's like still too much for them, they can work with South Coast to develop a custom compliance plan. So there's a ton of optionality built into how warehouse operators can comply with the WARE program. So when you think about an indirect source rule, a warehouse indirect source rule in particular, and you think about mitigating risk of federal preemption, it is possible that both the Clean Air Act and EPCA could preempt many state and local electric vehicle or zero emissions vehicle requirements. And so when you have that compliance optionality, the way the WARE program does, where warehouse operators can pick and choose the strategies they want to use to comply, that can help set the stage such that a court will view what you are doing as an incentive to purchase or use zero emissions vehicles rather than a requirement. So the WARE program, they can switch to ZEV trucks, or they can do a whole bunch of other things. And a district court in the Central District of California agreed. This amounted to an incentive. I will note that in South Coast got its warehouse ISR embedded in the SIP. I do not believe that that is required to pass muster if you can establish this compliance optionality such that you avoid preemption by the Clean Air Act or EPCA. But whether any particular ISR is preempted is going to be hyper fact specific, right? Like what are the options on the compliance menu? How are they weighted? How expensive are they? That's going to be something that's going to be very, very different from place to place. So we are seeing a couple of other early entries into the ISR space. New York City has a bill on the table that would have an ISR for warehouses, for distribution centers. It would cover warehouses 50,000 square feet and larger, so significantly smaller than the South Coast rule. I think it'll be really interesting to see how this one plays out, because the way this generally works is City Council, if they pass the bill, will pass the bill that essentially directs DEP in New York City to develop the actual, the rule, the point system. So we won't actually know what the details are for quite some time, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how New York City makes its ISR its own. In particular, New York City is very focused on using its waterways much more for freight. Many of these distribution centers are located on or near the waterfront, and they do not use it at all. And so a lot of folks are really interested in maybe having some of the points options include using water-based transportation. There's also a state-level bill. This has come before the state legislature a couple of times in New York. Again, very light on details because the bill itself, if passed, would direct New York City's Department of Environment, or New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation to develop a points-based ISR. So it's meant to look a lot like the South Coast rule, but we wouldn't really know what specifically the compliance options are until that rule is developed. This has been very popular among advocates. It's been introduced a couple of times. In 2024, it passed only the Senate, not the Assembly. So it's possible we'll see this one come back again. I'm also going to talk briefly. I don't know how much time I have left, Brennan, so I don't want to. A couple minutes? Yeah. Okay. So a second strategy, I'll just sort of shift rather abruptly from ISRs to a second strategy that many local governments are interested in, which is a low emissions delivery zone. And a low emissions delivery zone is sort of a collection of approaches that can incentivize using electric or zero emissions on-street delivery vehicles or perhaps non-vehicle modes of parcel delivery within neighborhoods. This is derivative of low emission zones and ultra low emission zones that are in places like London, elsewhere in Europe, a couple in Asia, I think. Those cities face obviously very different legal parameters than cities in the US, and so cities in the US have not been able to implement low emission zones in the same way. I would say New York City's congestion pricing is kind of the closest they've gotten. But a lot of the strategies that can be used to develop a low emission zone can sort of be used in a piecemeal or voluntary way to create these low emissions delivery zones. And again, the mandate and incentive distinction under both the Clean Air Act and EPCA preemption analyses is super important in the low emissions delivery zones context, especially if there's going to be any sort of like compliance penalty or other way in which folks are held accountable. You'll see as I talk through the couple of examples that I talk through, many of them are voluntary or almost voluntary because cities have not quite figured out how to thread that needle in a way that actually works from a practical point of view. So Santa Monica, partnering with the Los Angeles clean incubator, Lacey, on a 1 square mile ZED's zero emissions delivery zone pilot in downtown Santa Monica. And it used a number of strategies, including like priority access for certain loading areas for things like electric vans. So internal combustion engine vehicles were not allowed to load and unload in certain areas. They tried to amp up like micro mobility for various kinds of deliveries, so e-bikes and other things. There was a commercial EV sharing pilot that happened there. This was entirely voluntary. There was no accountability, no penalty for anything related to this zone, and internal combustion engine delivery vehicles could drive right through and find some place to load or unload that was not one of the priority areas. But this was a really great sort of start, like identifying the strategies that you would build into a zero emission zone, from prioritizing like e-cargo bikes for delivery and doing a lot more micro mobility and things like that. Portland, Oregon is also in the midst of a pilot, a zero emission delivery zone pilot, using a number of the same strategies, increasing micro delivery, the loading and unloading zones. They're also seeking to use more sensor technology to collect data about how all of this actually works. How does how are curbs actually used in downtown Portland to perhaps inform a longer term strategy? Just to sort of reiterate the incentive nature of this as opposed to the mandate nature of this, there are apparently 532 truck loading zones in downtown Portland, and 5 of them are reprioritized for zero emissions commercial trucks. So this is, it's an interesting start, but it is certainly not coming anywhere near the de facto mandate threshold. Again, mostly voluntary. I think there's a parking ticket component if you kind of park your regular old car in a EV space. And then the last one I'll talk about, Los Angeles has a little bit of a different approach where they focus purely on curb management. Curb management is one strategy that can factor into a low emissions delivery zone, and it's often about using the curb space that the city already owns and controls itself. So Los Angeles has a 2021 law that authorized the Department of Transportation to install, operate, and regulate these zero-emission vehicles' commercial loading zones. And it was to prioritize high-density, high-pollution areas. They're allowed to use like their parking regs authority and paint the curbs a certain color. You folks in this room could tell me if this is actually happening. My understanding is there's only a handful of these commercial loading zones that have actually been implemented in LA, but this is something that LA is toying with. So again, when you think about mitigating preemption risk in the low emissions delivery zone context, it's really about using a variety of approaches that together can help reduce internal combustion engine truck use, but without pushing a local government into that de facto mandate territory where a court might strike down what they're doing as preempted. Say there hasn't been a ton of policy innovation in the US on this yet, but there's certainly been a little bit of work in the voluntary low emission zones that I talked about, among a handful of others. So I will stop there. I'll hand things back to Adrian.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm very excited to be here at UCLA because, a couple decades ago, I moved out here to take a fellowship at NRDC, and I wasn't making much money, so I didn't have much to do, and the office had free coffee, so I spent a lot of time reading files, and I was working then for Gail Fierro, who many of you know now, Judge Fierro. And one of the boxes I came across was a box of files from very landmark litigation around the 1997/1999 SIP that the Coalition for Clean Air and NRDC brought about the Clean Air Plan for the region. And one of the memos written in the 90s was from a UCLA clinic student talking about indirect source rules. So I think, in the 90s, people were in this building, or I think it was this building. I assume it's this building. Yes, talking about indirect source rules. And fast forward now, we're still talking about them, and we have a lot of successes in California. So, folks, clinical students, those memos matter because they do influence even beyond the case. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of right to zero, because there was a lot of discussion about Clean Air Act and Clean Air Act planning, and a lot of our right to zero program at Earthjustice was centered around the air plans in California. And one of the things that was referenced, and I think it's a really landmark kind of admission from the 2022 Air Quality Management Plan for this region, was that to meet clean air standards, we have to get to zero emissions everywhere possible in stationary and mobile sources. And so from a scientific kind of just pollution standpoint, we've got to get to zero emissions. And so I think a lot of these local strategies, indirect source rules, the issues that are preventing us from doing more, it's not legal, it's not technical, it's political kind of will and concerns that are happening. And in fact, I think a lot of the debate around indirect source rules has devolved into clean air policy catastrophization or something. I was trying to think of a good word, but the idea, and I'll go over a little bit more. But one thing is, right to zero, we're working on transportation electrification, building electrification, industrial electrification, and trying to power it with clean energy. Couple things, just so where we're coming from, we think mandates are really important to move markets. That's why we prefer rules over MOUs or voluntary approaches. But we do advocate for zero emission incentives sometimes. And then we also are concerned about false solutions and rhetoric. So why indirect source rules from an environmental justice, community perspective? We think they're critical strategies for community health, more important now than ever as there's an assault on kind of the authority to do other types of regulations. And then the other thing is, I just want to dip in and I'll talk a little bit. It's not really that scary for regulated entities. And I'm going to go through the warehouse ISR. So one thing I did to prepare for this panel last week was I reread the whole, all the comments from the warehouse ISR rulemaking that happened in 2021 in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And so I finished reading all those comments, and I was like, wow. I walked outside expecting it to be like the scene from Blade Runner, but the sun was shining, the supermarket still had stuff on its shelves. I even saw a delivery truck from Amazon. There wasn't an economic apocalypse. And so I think this is important because I think the debate around ISRs and indirect source rules has been very charged. And I'd argue that a lot of the critiques of it aren't evidence-based. It's just kind of throwing whatever you can say about this type of regulation out there and claiming that it's the truth. So let's go through some of the claims that were made on the warehouse ISR. So the first one, the warehouse rule is illegal. That was said over and over and over again. I got tired reading it. The second, the cleaner technologies will not be there. This is 2021. There's concern, hey, they're not going to be near zero trucks. We were coming off the pandemic, and there were concerns about supply chains. And then the third was this will disproportionately impact Southern California's economy. We will see a mass exodus of the freight and logistics industry from the region. And, the comments were varying levels of concern on this, but, it was pretty elevated rhetoric to oppose the warehouse ISR. So let's go through all three of these arguments. So first, claims that warehouse rule is illegal. Wrong. We heard that there was a federal district court judge who did an extensive legal analysis. There's some great briefing. I think I'd encourage folks to read the South Coast AQMD's brief and the briefs from the California AG's office and the briefs from the NGOs that intervened. They're very well laid out. They provide a good kind of legal authority about where ISR stems from, what's the basis of the authority, and then also do a good job explaining that the ISR was an inherently flexible approach. The challenge failed from the airline industry and the California Trucking Association, and those entities chose not to appeal. One thing that was mentioned earlier that I just want to kind of reiterate on why indirect source rules are important as well is, we heard a lot about waivers and authorizations for state level regulations. It is true that you need kind of EPA's approval to, implement that. That's different than the indirect source rules. The authority for that really is the police power. So if it is in the federal SIP, that's great. That's an awesome thing. But you don't necessarily need to wait for that in order to make the rule implemented. And in fact, the warehouse ISR rule was being implemented even as we waited for EPA's approval. All right, let's go to the next one. Technology will not be there. Wrong. Okay, so this is a chart of what strategies people use. Basically, people said there wasn't going to be, no one's going to be able to use solar panels, and Z trucks won't be there, near zero trucks won't be there. But if you look at that bar chart on the bottom, what you see is a wide range of strategies used. A lot of zero emission hostler or yard dogs, whatever people call it, use. A lot of people getting points for near zero trucks, a lot of points for zero emission trucks, solar installation, filters. The technology was there. You set the mandate, people will implement the technology. It created an opportunity for clean technology providers to go to every warehouse in the region and say, hey, I've got this zero emission yard truck, or I've got this, technology, and the warehouses have implemented it. So I think that claim was wrong. And I think the other kind of key part of it that I thought was interesting is at one end, the Air District gave a fee option. So let's say you couldn't get any of these, and this was impossible. You could pay a fee. So the opponents of the regulation were like, that's a legal tax. But then it was also what provided flexibility. And it wasn't a legal tax, and no one sued because I think it was a pretty specious legal argument, and no one was really gonna take that to the next level. And then claims of harm to SoCal's economy. So we heard kind of stories that this was gonna result in economic apocalypse for the region. The AQMD did a robust economic analysis, and they said there will likely be no warehouses lost in the region, but there's a slight chance we may lose six warehouses out of thousands in the region. And I think the problem was people weren't hearing that. They did this robust analysis. They looked at different scenarios. And then what happened when they produced their second annual report in October of last year, they showed that there was a minimal impact. In fact, it's hard to discern any impact. I think overall warehouses are figuring out ways to comply, and it's not harming the region. And if anything, it's resulting in more zero-emission trucks, more investment. They've raised about $50 million in mitigation fees. And as state budgets and federal budgets start to dry up, this is a really important revenue source for clean technology. So what we saw was, if you look back at the history, the arguments made about indirect source rules didn't prove to be correct. But they did have a strong impact on the rulemaking through delays and shaping it and weakening the rule. So we're dealing with this a lot with other indirect source rules. We're seeing this with the port indirect source rule. People saying, if you think about an indirect source rule at the ports will shut down. That's a little hyperbole, but I feel like the one thing, given we are in an academic institution that's interested in evidence-based, research, rulemaking, I think it's important that we keep the evidence there, really understand what these rules do. They aren't as scary as they claim to be. And in fact, the air districts are doing a really flexible job in crafting the regulation. But in the interest of kind of this, I will make my own argument, and this one's for David Pettit. So 1 week after the second annual WARE report was released, showing no harm, Freddie Freeman hit a grand slam in Game 1 of the World Series at Dodger Stadiums. And I'll remind you a couple things. The South Coast Air Basin, where the baseball stadium is, has a warehouse ISR rule. I'm not going to say that it wasn't related to that. I can't say it was related to that. But as we're thinking about it, we heard today about, New York laws. So the Yankees want to win the World Series again. There's Bay Area is considering an indirect source rule. I know the Giants are interested.
So Fresno was home of the Giants AAA team when we had ISR. Yes. Seriously, Buster Posey was in Fresno when they adopted ISR. I'm just saying, you figured it out.
We may not have had Buster Posey if ISRs hadn't existed. So but I really do think it's important as we're working on this, the kind of making sure that evidence-based analysis and conclusion are forming the basis of these rules, and getting these rules across is really important. A couple things. The one thing is we want lots of ISRs. These are really important strategies for community health and environmental health, but there's a lot of local strategy. We've heard about green delivery zones. One other strategy that I think has been successful that we should consider in other port communities is, this is my strategy, clean truck fees. As we're in another kind of era of fiscal austerity, the San Pedro Bay ports have a clean truck fee. It's raising somewhere between $90 and $100 million per year for clean trucks. It's a low fee. They determined that they could handle a much higher fee. But if you look at the numbers, and it may not sound that big, but we have 445 battery electric trucks in our fleet right now. And these are Class 8, some of the largest trucks moving containers. This fee is a large part about why we're having success, in addition to other policies. So I'd encourage, as we're thinking about it, look at these clean truck fees, increasing them, adding them to other ports. This is another strategy that is really important to protecting public health and advancing clean air. So I'll leave it back to you.
Thank you to our panelists. I'm going to ask a few questions, and feel free to submit questions using the QR code. I'll start with Jessi about San Joaquin Valley. 2005. Take me back there to the mid 2000s. What lessons can we learn about stakeholder management and the political forces that were at play in terms of the board getting the gumption and the courage to go forth and create this pioneering, innovative regulation?
That's a really good question, especially as we deal with the political climate and how divisive everything is today. When San Joaquin Valley adopted ISR in 2005, we only had 11 board members on our board, and 8 of them were county supervisors. 3 of them were city council people, and they rotated from city to city. And people didn't stay on the board for very long either. Most of the county supervisors who would get on that board came in, and their very first meeting, they always said, "I'm here to fix this because you people are out of control." And there was always this vibe that the air district was doing too much, and the air district was not doing too much then or now. But what was really interesting is I think having that federal backstop was really, really key to the messaging for that agency. And that agency doesn't get everything right, but they really try to work with what they have and to get the things done they needed to get done. And that was one of the roles where I saw this messaging happen. I saw it a few other times in other projects I worked on, where you could see the board was not thrilled about ISR, right? Especially because you're talking about things that are adjacent to the land use decision-making that their other bodies were really responsible for managing. And here it felt like the air district was kind of infringing on that kind of role, but the air district was able to say, look, we're not attainment for PM10, we're not attainment for the 1979 one-hour ozone standard, we're not attainment for we were not attainment at that time for 4 different air quality standards. And they said, look, this is in the SIP, and if we don't do this, we're going to get sanctioned. And if we get sanctioned, it means it's going to be a de facto ban on new businesses or modified businesses because of the 2-to-1 offsets in the Clean Air Act. We're going to lose our highway funds. We're going to get FIP'd, which means Federal Implementation Plan. And we use it as a verb in the air quality biz. We used to say WTF for what the FIP. You don't want to get FIP'd, right? And so that the fact that you could go before that very, there's a lot of inertia, right? And this is if you haven't driven through the San Joaquin Valley, you're going to see a lot of Trump and Devin Nunes signs on the billboards on the highway, right? And so, but these people knew that they didn't want to lose highway funds. They didn't want to lose, they didn't want the permitting ban. They didn't want to lose federal control. And so having that interplay between, like, you have to do something, right? Like, it's one thing to have health-based standards, but you don't want to get sanctioned at the same time. And ultimately, they recognized, because of the messaging, the hard work of the staff, but also because of the advocates on the other side of that argument who showed up at those meetings and made it clear, I have asthma, my community has asthma, and this is before AB 617 areas, and they showed up and provided the counterpoint and made it so clear that our region needed these rules in place as soon as possible because people were getting sick and people weren't going to experience healthy air for a long, long time, so it was really important for everyone to do everything they could. And so I would really encourage you, if you're representing advocates, don't sit out of a fight because you agree. I think sometimes people say, oh, well, I agree with what that agency is doing, so I don't need to comment. No, that's when you need to, that's when you need to comment even more. If you like what they're doing, don't take for granted that they'll get it over the finish line without you. You have to show up and tell them why you need that. And so I think those two dynamics were absolutely critical at that time. The fact that there was that federal threat, that backstop. And I worry about that now. I worry about the weakening of those backstops that's going to make agencies less motivated to be innovative because everyone's scared about getting sued all over the place, but also having people show up and really advocate for doing better. One other point I wanted to make is you talked about, the sky is falling kind of arguments and the things that people throw out, a lot of it's emotional, a lot of it you can't really document, you make it up as you go. I remember for ISR, they said, oh, the price of houses is going to go up $700 per unit. And at the time, it's like, but houses are like $300,000. Like, is $700. Like, how do you even document that? Isn't going to happen. Like, and like just what you know about the market and how complex it is for housing. Of course, that didn't happen, right? Like, people are still building and buying houses in the San Joaquin Valley. So it's another example how it's just really easy for people to throw things out. And we don't know. Like, you don't ever really know for sure. One of my very favorite, to take your baseball thing going, because I love baseball. We should just talk about baseball the rest of the time. But there was a court case where it was about like a Clean Air Act case and about modeling, and the DC Circuit Court said that the best computer model in the world might show that the Washington Nationals will win the World Series, and if they don't, you don't fault the model. That's just the uncertainty inherent in this kind of work. We don't always know everything, and you can't use that, and they didn't, by the way. They didn't win the World Series that year. So the model was flawed for the DC Circuit, but it just goes to show, like, you can't be paralyzed by uncertainty or people who maybe look very certain, and maybe they're not as certain as they seem.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have an audience question. With the 2028 Olympics coming, what about regulating place-based pollution from these massive stadiums and event centers, or just any new frontiers for ISR application that you see coming down?
Me?
Either of you?
Oh, you go. I think that'd be an interesting thing to pursue. I think we need to get through the port indirect source rule, revisit the rail indirect source rule, and I'd focus probably on making our structure for airports and move from an MOU to a more mandatory program, because I think the airports are falling short. But then fourth, let's think about this. I think it could be something to pursue.
Yeah, I would actually think about a lot of the low emission zone strategies in connection with those venues. So, how do you get as many folks, I know there's already a public transit push around the Olympics, but get as many folks coming by transit or bike or walking. For vehicles that are coming into the space, how can you incentivize that perhaps those vehicles be electric if people are taking taxis or lifts or whatever? Finding ways for deliveries to those spaces to be made by low emissions vehicles, creative use of curb spaces. Like, I think there's a lot that can be done in and around those spaces, and it would be a good excuse to activate some of them with some of these strategies.
Thanks. We have a question from our earlier panelist, Joe Liu, from the Coalition for Clean Air. Does CARB need new legislative authority to impose ISR requirements on facilities? In state non-attainment basins, couldn't CARB write ISR regulations into the local district plans under the California Health and Safety Code? This is for anyone who wants to answer.
I think the authority is stronger if we can get it specifically, directly stated in the Health and Safety Code. I think there's probably some ambiguity without it, but I think where our position is definitely stronger if it's specifically written in the Health and Safety Code, and hopefully we get it soon.
Yeah, and I think AB 914 is specifically referenced to clarify. I think there are folks who think the authority's there, but let's get AB 914 across the hump, and then it's clarified.
Any of you, could you talk about the impact of changing the board composition of air district boards? There have been additions of appointed air district board members by the governor or the Senate Rules Committee chair, or doctors or public health advocates. Have you seen board compositional changes affecting the adoption of these sort of strategies?
Yeah, I'll start. I mentioned that when the San Joaquin Valley's ISR was adopted, we had 11 people on our board, and 8 of them were county, because it's an 8-county region, so there were 8 county supervisors and 3 rotating city seats. And shortly thereafter, advocates pushed the state legislature to change the makeup of the San Joaquin Valley Board. And so now the San Joaquin Valley Board has 15 board members. So we still have the 8 county supervisors. Now we have not we anymore. I don't work there anymore. They, my card people are so embarrassed of me right now. And they're like, oh, Jessi, you don't work there anymore. They have 5 city seats that rotate, and you're supposed to have like a big, small, and medium city, and you rotate through the counties. And then there are 2 governor appointees. There's like an atmospheric scientist and then a public health advocate as well. So I think having just more diverse voices on the board is very helpful. You know, the governor appointees alone aren't going to have huge sways in where various programs go, but having them there to state on the record whenever they can, you know, this is a public health issue, I'm worried about this, or I think the evidence says this, like having that voice there is really, really helpful. But it's not something to take for granted that it will go the way you think it will go either. The very first doctor that was appointed to the San Joaquin Valley Board, his name was Dr. Tellis, and this was around 2010-ish or 2009-ish. His very first board meeting, the first thing he said was, I don't think air quality is a big health concern. I just think health insurance and jobs are more important, because if people don't have jobs, they don't have health insurance, they can't go to the doctor. That was the first thing he said on that board, and he voted according to those sentiments just about every chance he got. So I don't think it's a given that it will have the sway that you think it will, but I do think in the San Joaquin Valley example, their current board structure is more effective for the job before them right now than it was back in 2005.
I haven't vetted this, but I was talking internally, or not internally, to someone earlier. I think board composition is important. I think we need better disclosure laws of lobbying at air districts. We did an analysis in a recent rulemaking of kind of entities that were participating who we'd never seen before, to understand kind of why were they participating. And we found a very high correlation with receipts of funding from a very large Fortune 500 company. And so as much as it would create more work, I think, on the NGO community, I think there's a lot of money and influence push forward at South Coast AQMD that goes unreported. And it's not illegal. It's the law doesn't require a lot of reporting. I think that would be helpful, because we need to understand who's spending money, who's influencing these decisions, because it's never the entities coming straight out and saying it's them. It's someone else advocating for that position. That's just a thought.
So, Amy, with regard to the New York State bill or the New York City measures, how have you seen policymakers partner with like frontline community organizations and take into account the communities that are like bearing disproportionately the brunt of air pollution when adopting or crafting these measures?
I mean, this is so just central to developing a warehouse ISR. I mean, many, many, many distribution centers are located within low-income communities, within environmental justice communities. And I would say, this is a policy area where the city, at least, and advocates to a great extent, have been very good about bringing those folks to the fore. I attended the city council hearing a couple of weeks ago for New York City's bill. There was an excellent representation of folks from frontline communities who live in, areas where these facilities are located, describing the types of impacts that they face. There are other really interesting stakeholders in this as well. We had a number of folks testify who were either Amazon workers or former Amazon workers. And so, they were really pushing city council to expand the scope of the bill to not only cover the pollution, which they had really interesting insights into about like what kind of trucks came in and out of the warehouse, like data that the city did not have, advocates did not have. They would just be like, oh yeah, we saw that kind of truck all the time. But they also talked about the real need for like labor protections for folks that are working in these distribution centers, and really pushed city council either in that bill or in a parallel bill to think about the problem holistically. So, I feel like a lot of times environmental protections, the advocacy around them, at least historically, has been, woefully lacking in terms of bringing, frontline stakeholders, workers, et cetera, to the table. And I would say indirect source rules, just because really of like what they are and where these distribution facilities are located, has been a pretty good case study in doing it in a better way.
Great. Well, that's all the time that we have, so let's give a last round of applause to our panelists who are available for questions afterwards. I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Great, and we'll take a slightly less than 15-minute break. We'll be back here at 2:30. Thanks.